Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm the director of the Global Development Policy Center here at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. The GDP Center's mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the world. One of the GDP Center's signature programs is called the Global Economic Governance Initiative, which studies the extent to which global economic governance institutions like the World Trade Organization, multilateral development banks, and the International Monetary Fund foster financial stability, well-being, and environmental sustainability. And the IMF is one institution that we've been studying for some time. The COVID-19 virus has been a shock to the world and the world economy, to say the least. We're now approaching 3 million deaths worldwide, with new strands on the rise and the promise of vaccination in many emerging market and developing countries not coming to 2022 and in some cases 2023. The IMF noted last year that 2020 was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, with upwards of 100 million people being pushed into extreme poverty. For Latin America and the Caribbean, the region the hardest hit, the downturn was the worst in 120 years and put the region back to its 2010 GDP per capita terms. In other words, another lost decade for Latin America with respect to economic growth. Earlier this week, the United Nations Development Program sees 72 countries at risk for external debt distress this year, and the vast majority of those countries in middle-income countries that are not covered by current G20 debt schemes. Many countries are using 30 to 70% of all their tax revenue to pay for debts during the crisis. The UNDP says that this year, close to $1.1 trillion is due in debt service payments. Just 2.5% of that amount would be enough to vaccinate 2 billion people under the COVAX initiative. The service of debt, public debt, crowds out room for investments, in developing countries must plan to achieve a green and equitable recovery. On top of COVID, 2020 was also tied for the warmest year on record, with weather-related damages reaching $268 billion in 2020. So many countries, such as small island development states, are suffering a triple crisis of the COVID virus, debt and liquidity issues, and climate change. The International Monetary Fund is the most important global institution charged with global financial stability and has quickly stepped in to play a role in mitigating the crisis. Today, in partnership with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the GDP Center highlights a cluster of papers and accompanying data portals that track the IMF response to the COVID-19 crisis. The three interactives that we'll be dropping links to in the chat here are as follows. One of them is called the Global Financial Safety Net Tracker, or the GFSN Tracker, which tracks the lending capacity available to each country from central banks, the International Monetary Fund, and regional financial arrangements during the crisis. Second is the IMF COVID-19 Recovery Index, which measures the extent to which IMF emergency programs in the COVID era encourage member nations to attack the virus, protect the vulnerable, and mount a green and inclusive recovery. And third is the IMF COVID-19 Surveillance Monitor, which measures the extent to which IMF Article 4 reports have prioritized health, the poor, and climate change in the COVID era. The IMF was quick to provide bold thought leadership beginning in early 2020 as the crisis became a global one, citing a need to mobilize around $2.5 trillion for emerging market and developing countries. The IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, has repeatedly called for a major new issuance of special drawing rights, a mobilization of the IMF balance sheet, and a global focus on attacking the virus, protecting the vulnerable, and mounting a green recovery. While rebuffed last year by the United States, the major news this week is that the IMF is now set to approve an initial issuance of $650 billion worth of special drawing rights, 2/5 of which will flow to emerging market and developing countries. On some of the other fronts, however, my colleagues will share research and interactives that indicate the IMF has not yet matched the powerful thought leadership with policy action. Going in the order that I'll speak of now, Barbara Fritz, a colleague and economist at the Freie University of Berlin and one of the architects of the GFSN Tracker, finds that the coverage of the GFSN is uneven across geographies and income levels, and that many IMF members have been reluctant to go to the IMF for financing beyond the IMF's short-term facilities that lack the conditionalities that they see as stigmatizing and counterproductive during recessions. Franco Maldonado, a pre-doctoral fellow here at the GDP Center from BU's Department of Economics and a lead researcher on the IMF COVID Recovery Index, finds that for those countries that did receive IMF programs, that the IMF has been quick to encourage countries to focus on attacking the virus and protecting the vulnerable, at least in the short term. However, there's been less attention to a green recovery in the vast majority of IMF emergency financing programs. Luma Ramos is a postdoctoral fellow here at the GDP Center and holds a PhD in macroeconomics from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in her native Brazil. Luma is a lead researcher on the IMF COVID-19 surveillance monitor and finds that the IMF has also been quick to prioritize healthcare spending and resilience in IMF surveillance activity. But as is the case in the emergency financing programs, with a couple notable exceptions, IMF surveillance is thus far not focused on climate change or a green recovery. Given that climate change is a bit of an anomaly here, I'll also make a quick presentation on some supplementary work that we've done on the IMF and climate change. Following short presentations of this work, we have the honor of commentary by Prakash Loungani. He's a well-known macroeconomist who is now Assistant Director of the IMF's Internal Evaluation Office, where he's heading the IEO's evaluation of the IMF response to the COVID-19 crisis. If we all are good on time, we should have at least about a half hour for questions and answers with all of you in the audience. If you look at your Zoom screen here in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a Q&A button. So please first tell us who you are. Let's have a global conversation. Tell us your name and affiliation and add a question throughout the presentations. When we're done with the presentations, we'll move to Q&A where I'll field questions and give them to the speakers and to Dr. Loungani. Let me share my screen and move to our first speaker, which is Barbara Fritz. Everyone see that?
Kevin, you're still in the present. Okay, no, we can't see. Go to the next slide, maybe. No, we still see the announcement of the webinar.
Okay, hold on one second.
I think you have to go to the next slide.
Excuse me, I just want to go to mute. So, okay.
Now we have the presenter's view.
Okay, how's this?
Yeah,
okay?
Next slide.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks, Kevin, for bringing all of us together. I will start talking on the inequalities in the global financial safety net under the current pandemic. This is collaborative work with Larissa Mühlich, Bill Craig, and Kevin Gallagher. And I start with my main messages I want to take you to. First, the global financial safety net, which I abbreviate as a GFSN, has evolved strongly over time, but it's still underfunded, what we find, and it provides unequal coverage. Second, important elements of the GFSN do not serve in the crisis. And third, we learn from this that the quality of lending, especially of the IMF, has to improve to change this. Next, okay, thank you. Now, what is the global financial safety net? It started as a single institution in the Bretton Woods era with the IMF. Over time, it did not only increase in volume, but also in complexity. We today have a largely increased IMF with 1 trillion lending capacity, plus a large number of regional financial arrangements, RFAs, in all parts of the world, like the Latin American Reserve Fund, the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization from the 90s, or the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development in the 2000s. And these regional funds, which join mostly neighboring countries, which pool part of their foreign exchange reserves and lend it to member countries when they are in need for emergency liquidity, they today join also $1 trillion, which is the same sum as the IMF. And we have a third element, which are bilateral central bank currency swaps. These are instruments where two central banks mutually lend, make disposable liquidity in their own currency to another country, and the other country can draw on this liquidity when it is in need. And these instruments, which are provided especially by the Federal Reserve, the People's Bank of China, but also other central banks in the world, now bring together $1.5 trillion in 2018. Next, please. This means that countries can, when they have at their disposal RFAs and or swaps, they can choose when they need emergency liquidity. When we break down the liquidity available at the GFSN, we see the following. And first, I have to introduce that we here distinguish for the IMF between the standard conditional lending, which is the dark green, and the non-standard conditional lending like rapid finance instrument and other new credit lines, which is the light green. The blue is swaps and the red is the RFAs. When we break down this on the left side of the two graphs, for income groups, we see that the insurance provided by the GFSN highly concentrates on higher income countries, while the lower income countries are much less protected. When you turn your attention to the right side of these two graphs, you see the same unequal coverage in terms of regions. We see East Asia and Europe very well insured by the GFSN and all its elements, but much less poorer regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Middle East. Next, please. To get an understanding of the current use of the GFSN in times of the pandemic, we created, with the support of UNCTAD, the Global Financial Safety Net Tracker, as Kevin announced, which is a platform for information sharing on member country finance strategies in the current pandemic. This allows us to visualize the complexity of the GFSN by countries and by sources and by other perspectives, and to get an understanding of what is going on. Next, please. Our first analysis of what has been going on in terms of lending and providing swap arrangements at the global level shows us that first, the IMF, the RFA are in very little use. For the IMF, we see that only 108 billion of the 1 trillion, which is 10%, is being demanded by countries at the moment. For RFAs, this level is even lower. It's 4% of its $1 trillion lending capacity. To the contrary, swaps have been a very active instrument. We're increasing from 2018 now to 1.7 trillion. So swaps are dominating in the current use of the GFSN, the three elements by far. When we look at the left graph, we see that swaps again in their provision are highly concentrated on higher income countries. When we look on the right side, we see again that the current provision of swaps is highly concentrated on East Asia and the Pacific. The countries providing these swaps to poorer countries are, as I said, mostly the Federal Reserve, the People's Bank of China, but also Japan, to some degree also Switzerland, Sweden, Australia, and a range of countries. And what we also see for the case of the IMF, that the non-conditional lending is in much higher demand, the light green than the dark green, which is the conditional lending instrument of the IMF. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, I conclude. We have little use of the multilateral institutions, the IMF and the RFA, until now. This might be the calm before the storm because we know that at the moment financial markets provide very high levels of liquidity, which might change due to changing sentiments of the global financial markets and due to increasing debt levels in emerging markets and developing countries. And if demand grows significantly, we can see that eventually poorer countries and regions might be underinsured by the current global financial safety net. We also see a shifting weight towards swaps, which are the non-multilateral element in this complex system. Swaps, by their nature, are dominated by national interests, being their trade interests, financial interests, or geopolitical interests. But they are not agreed multilaterally. And we currently are talking much about vaccination diplomacy at the global level. We might also be observing a new liquidity diplomacy of swaps, which might be crowding out IMF and RFA. Next month will show if this is really the case, but there seems to be a risk. And this takes me to the main policy lesson that it's important to prevent this demultilateralization move to make the multilateral institutions of the GFSN more attractive. This means first, IMF and RFA should cooperate more at ICE level, and second, that the IMF should sincerely rethink its standard conditionality to increase demand for it and to get back to the center of action. Thank you for this. And with this, I hand over to Franco Maldonado, who will present an IMF recovery index.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Franco.
Thank you very much, Kevin and Barbara, for the introduction. So far, we have heard a great research about the role and the actions among the global financial safety net. However, we want to focus how was the IMF performance in the recent COVID-19 crisis to promote certain policies. Next slide, please. In particular, we want to focus on to what extent the IMF made effective actions in line with the guidances and the speeches. Two elements that I want you to grab from this research is that first, the IMF was actively engaged in supporting countries' policies oriented to boost health systems and support for the vulnerable. However, the IMF did not actively promote policies oriented to green recovery. Let me enter a little bit in detail about these elements. Next slide, please. Up to January of this year, the IMF support 85 countries with almost $105 billion in the broad number of programs, 119 in particular, with different degrees of conditionality. Two elements from this is, the first one, it's 89% of the programs were below $1 billion. In the average disbursement of these programs was around $500,000, and they were as small as the program received that Sao Tome and Principe received, that it was almost $2 million. The second element is the majority of these disbursements were equal or below 100% of the country's quota. The reason behind is that the majority of the programs or the disbursement made during the COVID-19 crisis were made due unconditional instruments like the rapid credit facilities and the rapid financial instruments that they were kept with 100% quota. Next slide, please. So what we do is during this time, the worth among $105 billion. And we score each program between 0 and 3 based on the IMF engagement to promote 3 particular kinds of policies. One of them, health expenditure, The other one, support for the vulnerable. And finally, green recovery. We receive a score of 0 would imply that neither the IMF or the country have interest on these kind of policies, or a score of 3 would imply that the IMF actively recommend or impose conditions to the countries in a particular kind of policy. Next slide, please. The results of this score shows, as a general, and we can see here in this black bubble, that the IMF fell short to fully put into practice all 3 pillars. At least one of the 3 pillars was not fully addressed or was not taken into account by the IMF. But looking into each of one of these pillars, we see different kind of behavior. First, that as we see in the green bubble, the IMF was actively involved in acknowledging and embracing policies for help and supporting for the vulnerable, while as we see in the red bubble, we saw a poor performance in engaging in countries for a green recovery. Next slide, please. If we divide these by the degree, one before, please. If we divide these by the extent of the conditionality of the programs, we see that conditional programs have a higher level of engagement, in particular, in support for the vulnerable. One element is that the IMF have been recommending actively cash transfers and other kind of safety nets. But also, despite this is still low, the IMF puts some interest on green recovery, in particular, the ones that are affected, but the ones that have direct financial impacts, like fossil fuel subsidies or environmental taxes. Next slide, please. If we divide these by the income level, we can see also that the level of engagement in health and support for the vulnerable policies decreases by the country income level. Next, please. We would like to tell you that you can find the report in the CRP COVID Economics Journal. There is a link there, and also in the interactive that we share with you in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franco. And now we'll move to Luma Ramos.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. First of all, I would like to thank you, Maureen, for organizing this meeting and for all you that is listening to us. And today I'm gonna present to you and discuss a little bit about our work, IMF COVID-19 Surveillance Monitor. Well, the IMF COVID-19 Surveillance Monitor measures the extent to which IMF country surveillance in the aftermath of the COVID-19 economic crisis has identified risks and mitigation measures to improve health outcomes, support for the vulnerable people and firms, and address climate change. Kevin, next slide, please. Well, I think there's something that I want to address is that the context of this discussion here matters. Well, the IMF surveillance guidelines are under review. So here we have an opportunity to shed light to very important issues. So as these bilateral surveillance tools are being updated, I think that this is we hope that this work may help in some degree. Well, our key findings were the IMF has previously given little attention to health, protect for the vulnerable, and especially climate change, following Franco's results, as he mentioned a little bit. And relatively more focus on fiscal consolidations. Well, this changed in 2020 when IMF increased focus on health, support for the vulnerable in Article 4. However, attention to climate change remains secondary at best. And this, Kevin will talk a little bit more later. And following, we observe asymmetrical guidance in key surveillance themes. In nations that most needed IMF advice, there were few recommendations and assessments. Kevin, next, please. Well, and how has the IMF pandemic how the COVID-19 pandemic affect the IMF attention to these areas? Well, here we can see how these topics performed before in 2019 and 2020. Overall, we observe a significant improvement in this topic and discussion in 2020. When we look at the total median of the monitor scores, we highlight improvement, an increase from 0.33% to 1.35%, which is a very significant improvement and jump in IMF discussions in surveillance documents. And most of it was led by discussions in health issues. Here we can see that the median jumped from 0.06% to 0.89%. And these discussions that we are talking about, we are pointing out recommendations and advice about medical supplies, vaccines, and healthcare. And also, we observe some certain degree of improvement in support for the vulnerable. And here we are talking about support, cash transfer, safety net, and protect jobs, advice and recommendations in these areas. However, one point that keep it short was climate change, because even though we saw like a small improvement, it's still very low discussion about climate change in IMF surveillance documents and IMF surveillance agenda overall. Next slide, please. Moving forward, we try to capture how these priorities have been discussed between countries and income levels. Well, and then we have like this figure that highlights and show us very important results. Well, when we analyze the monitor scores in 2019, it shows that the top scores are centered in high-income countries. And here we can see Singapore, Finland, Belgium, that has the most discussions in these topics. And the opposite is also valid. So the bottom 10 countries, the bottom 10 scores are related to low-income countries or middle-income countries. Well, and this is kind of problematic. Why? Well, this is problematic because this shows the IMF guidance is asymmetrical, and this shows like uneven behavior in these surveillance documents. And we see like a more engagement and more discussions in high-income countries. And also when we look at the bottom 10, and here I see some examples like Congo, Chad, Ghana, South Sudan. They are countries that suffer from poor infrastructure, for example. So they have problems with logistics and sanitation, sewage. So this makes them less resilient to climate shocks or more vulnerable to spread of disease. And even though IMF has paid little attention to this topic in these countries. Well, and something that this is important to highlight that into 2020, we didn't have a full circle of consultations in the whole countries. So we can make these comparisons or this kind of exercise between these years. Next slide, please. Finally, there is like a critique. I also critique about the IMF posture and behavior that is like even a fiscal consolidation forward. And here we made an exercise to compare how financial topics are being discussed in relation to this health, support for the vulnerable, and climate. And here we have like a screenshot of an R&D release interactive. And this is very interesting to note that one point. This means when the ratio is higher than 1, like Germany or United States, Belgium in 2020, this means that this health, for example, health in 2020, and this means that health is more discussed than fiscal elements. And the inverse is also valid. And climate, this in between 2019 and 2020 was way below. So this means that climate issues were less discussion than fiscal consolidations. Next slide, please. Oh, finally, we have here just some points of our methodology. And as I'm running out of time, if you have interest in just look at our documents, that it's next slide, please. If you want to know more about the methodology and more results and how we are discussing the surveillance tools and documents, just look at the working paper that is on the GDP Center website. We have this interactive that was just released and the blog post. And now we have Kevin talking about a little more climate change.
Thanks so much, Luma. In the interest of time, we really want to make sure that we can hear from Prakash Loungani and have engagement with all of you in the audience. We see a lot of great questions and a lot of people here. So I'm actually not going to do my full presentation. We have a paper that we dropped in the chat where we went deeper into IMF surveillance and climate change to create a baseline analysis. We heard last week that the IMF is currently examining something called a comprehensive surveillance review. It's reviewing its surveillance activities and is potentially going to incorporate climate change in them. And so we've created a sort of baseline analysis using the same textual analysis tools that Luma talked about. We have 3 key findings. One, that there's 3 types of climate risks that are macro critical and therefore should be at the center of IMF surveillance activity. That's physical risk, such as, say, incidents of hurricanes in Barbados, transition risk, say when a country needs to move away from coal as a core component of its energy system, and spillover transition risk, say when the country in an advanced economy makes a quick transition, say a carbon tax, that'll have negative impacts on financial systems and fiscal systems in emerging market and developing countries. So we apply a textual analysis algorithm exercise and find that the IMF has paid very little attention to these 3 issues to date in their Article 4s and their financial sector assessment programs. But they have piloted interesting techniques that can be mainstream and scaled. Our conclusion is that it's imperative that the IMF incorporate these 3 types of climate risk equally across all their Article 4 and FSAPs, and that really the time to do that is now with the comprehensive surveillance review and the review of the FSAP. These things only get done every 4 or 5 years, and policies and decisions that they make in the next couple months will last for a long time, and we don't have much time to wait. So I'm going to skip through my presentation. I'm happy to share it with others, and we have these are all in research papers that are in the chat. I now want to introduce Prakash Loungani. He is the Assistant Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the International Monetary Fund, and he's leading the effort on the IMF's response to the COVID-19 crisis. Prakash, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here with you and your team and co-authors. I think we've long recognized you here at the IMF as one of our most thoughtful followers and occasional critics. So it's great to see you leading an effort that is fairly ambitious in its scale and scope with these 3 products. We go to the next slide. So I think these products provide really valuable tracking of IMF actions and advice, and I am particularly grateful for the timing of this effort. Just as you mentioned, I'm leading the evaluation of the IMF's response to the pandemic. So we will be covering roughly what the IMF did between March 2020 and March 2021. So all of this will be extremely useful to me, and please expect questions from myself and my team on these indices as we get deeper in our own work. I've sort of read through the briefing papers that go with these products, and I've kind of played with the indices myself using your interactives. I think these are all extremely useful. Obviously, as you go forward, some robustness checks will be useful. I know these are initial attempts, but some checks such as, do perturbations of your search term change the indices too much, or are they fairly robust to changes? I think these kinds of robustness checks will make the products even more useful. As a consumer of these products, I would like to know the relationship to other trackers that are available. We had a webinar at the IEO a few days back where we had folks from Oxfam, from CSIS present their own trackers, some of which have some overlap with what you're doing. So as a consumer, it would be helpful for me to know what are the kind of niche areas that you folks are bringing that are not present in the other trackers. And I really enjoyed the kind of what I call qualitative assessments. So, I mean, of course, you want the idea of the project is to provide indices for a broad group of countries, but I also like the comments that you folks offer on particular cases where you have past knowledge or expertise, or you're able to bring in some other evidence to support what the indices are saying. I think this kind of case study evidence is very useful and builds confidence in the indices. Next slide, please. So I have a few reactions to each of your products. I think the GFSN Tracker clearly shows, and Barbara's slides were really nice in showing that it's patchy and threadbare for some countries. As I mentioned, it would be good for me to know what the relationship is with the CSIS tracker. Stephanie Siegel presented in our IEO webinar a few days back. And I'd like to know if it makes a difference adding in the role of the new institutions, the AIIB, the NDB. Does that provide greater coverage for some countries? She also highlighted sort of the role the EIB has played during the COVID crisis. How that has worked out for Europe would be something that would be useful. My main comment on your tracker is, it also came up in Barbara's presentation, is this kind of tension a bit between competition versus coordination. At some point in your discussion, you seem to suggest that some amount of competition is healthy because it keeps all the providers on their toes. It gives governments some enhanced bargaining power. But I think, as Barbara concluded in her presentation today, I think a healthier state of affairs is probably coordination. These are all public agencies relying on taxpayer support. They should be, at the end of the day, providing to their member countries a safety net that is not patchy, that is not threadbare. So I think, I hope you will develop this further in your work, is what kinds of coordinations would work best. I know that she mentioned that coordination between the IMF and the RFAs would be critical. Next one, please. On your COVID-19 surveillance monitor, I think this is going to be extremely useful over this year as the IMF's Article 4 activity picks up. So I'm really hopeful that you will keep this updated regularly over the course of this year, because it will really be interesting to see how the IMF reflects the particular areas that you're focusing on in its Article 4 reports. One question that I have about both this index and the third one is, to what extent do these, I'm sorry, there's a typo, to what extent do these indices reveal IMF preferences versus those of the country authorities? before an Article 4 mission, there generally is kind of a questionnaire that goes to the country authorities from the IMF saying, here are some issues that we could possibly discuss. The country authorities come back and say, yes, this looks good, that doesn't, let's not talk about this, we don't have time, etc. So even though the Article 4 report in the end is written by the staff, what goes into the report and particularly into the selected issues paper is to some extent, or to a large extent, a kind of agreed script between the country authorities. So sometimes a country authority may say, well, we don't really want to discuss climate. They may say, climate is extremely important, but look, we have other people advising us. And frankly, we don't think you at the IMF can add anything to this. So sometimes climate is not discussed at the preference of the country authorities. So I think this is an issue that you need to confront in your indices, is that sometimes country authorities play a big role in determining what ends up in an Article 4 and what does not. I found the fiscal adjustment index extremely useful. I think, as Luma said, that's going to be a kind of critical area in the coming year or two. And I think that in the case of the fiscal adjustment index, you can actually match it against other quantitative indicators, such as a fiscal balance. So it would be interesting to see whether changes in your fiscal adjustment index correlate or do not with quantitative indicators. So I think that would boost confidence in some of the other sub-indices which do not lend themselves as easily to quantitative measurement. One other thing that I want to mention is that your analysis is sort of country by country, which is good. But there is also this issue of spillovers. What a country ought to be doing or decides to do is often dependent in part on what other countries are doing. And in particular, what sort of so-called source countries do matters a lot for recipient countries. So it's not always bad if the IMF is advising the US and Germany to do a lot of fiscal action under certain circumstances, because that fiscal action can actually be very beneficial for the global economy and for recipient countries. So I don't think you should, in a sense, be penalizing the IMF for focusing its attention on particular countries when that is the need of the moment, because that action is going to do a lot more for Burkina Faso, perhaps, than anything that Burkina Faso can do on its own fiscal actions. Next slide, please. The recovery index, Kevin, you and Franco very kindly presented in our own IEO webinar last year. I think we gave you some reactions there. Some of my comments apply to this index as well. So let me not repeat those. Let me just end with a side note on building back greener. I agree this is a very important aspect of IMF advice and of what happens at the country level and at the global level is, of course, extremely important. Let me plug some of my own work here, which does not provide much basis for optimism based on past experience. What we find in our work is that there's a very strong environmental Okun's law. When global activity or country activity falls, emissions plummet. But when activity recovers, they go back by just about the same amount. And in our paper, we quantify that the Okun's law is fairly symmetric. So at least based on past evidence, when you start to have global and country recoveries, you're going to have a bounce back in emissions that is just going to be proportional to the decline during the downturns. So this time indeed will need to be different if we are serious about building back greener. So let me stop there, but again, repeat my admiration for this attempt to put together a really comprehensive view of what the IMF has been up to. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Prakash, and all my colleagues for concise concise presentations of all this. If you look in the chat, you can see that we put links to these different interactives, the associated papers. Maureen, it would actually be great if you could put Prakash's energy policy, closer a classic paper on energy policy there on Okun's law. It's an important paper that hopefully we can make it different this time. I'll field some questions. We have one from Scott Vaughn. Scott Vaughn is the former executive director of the Institute for International Sustainable Development, and now the head of the China Council on International Cooperation on Environment and Development. He says, two questions. Are central bank currency swaps primarily used for very short-term goals like foreign exchange volatility? And any views on what needs to happen for the common framework negotiations with Chad to succeed more broadly in the months ahead? Mikel Munoz from the Stockholm Environment Institute asks for Prakash, is there any way to measure or discern when the driver to leave climate change out of Article 4 is the country or the International Monetary Fund? Why don't we start with those few? First with Barbara and then Prakash.
Okay, thank you so much for the comment. First to Prakash Loungani and to the questions. I will start with the two questions Prakash Loungani put. First, what is our relation to other trackers like the CIS? They cover the response of multilateral development banks, which we do not include. But we include and go very thoroughly through this, the swaps, the bilateral swaps, which are incredibly difficult to track because you have to go to each central bank website to be able to follow what is going on. That's our specialty. And it would be great also to include the multilateral development banks because they seem to play an increasing role. Maybe in the next round we will be able to do that. This leads me to Scott Vaughan's question, and I come back then to the coordination issue. What are swaps if they are especially used for very short-term goals? What we see is that swaps can have a maturity from a few months to 2 or 3 years. And central banks draw on these on very different occasions. Some of these are linked to trade issues, some of these linked to financial issues. So the use, what we see until now, is very diverse. And one of our next steps will be to go more into that jungle of diversity of swap arrangements. To the issue of coordination, yes, coordination between RFAs and IMF would be important. There are starting initiatives which have led to a common paper, framework paper in 2018, but this has been rather on the level of intentions, and we cannot see very much there. Some cases of cooperation, but we see very little until now in practice. And this could be brought forward. But more importantly, even might be to bring into the discussion, to the table of discussion, also the big central banks which provide swaps. And there the IMF could have a great role also to bring together at least for discussions the relevant elements of the GFSN. Thank you.
Thanks. On Mikel's question about whether you can discern authorities versus IMF preferences, not very easily. If it had been, I think Kevin and his team would have figured some way to incorporate that in the construction of their indices. One tip is what the selected issues papers cover. So the Article 4 obviously has to have a somewhat standard format and at least cover the main areas in terms of monetary, fiscal, external sector, and so on. So it has a set format in that sense. But the choice of the background selected issues papers, which are areas in which the IMF goes into greater depth, are often an indication of what the authorities would find it useful to discuss. So I think that can provide valuable additional information on what the authorities might have decided. So because those are indeed talked about between the country team and the authorities, and they kind of, it would be rare for the IMF to say, well, whether you like it or not, we're going to do a paper on your healthcare system because we think it's, needs some issues there. I think it would be somewhat odd for the IMF to just insist on that. It may do that in certain circumstances, but I think that gives you a clue on whether the country authorities are receptive to discussions of certain areas. And also, I think on the climate, it doesn't address your question, but something that Kevin mentioned. I mean, the IMF did do a pilot of incorporating climate considerations into Article 4 surveillance. So that may be a useful thing for you folks to look at as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, Prakash. Yes, in the accompanying paper that we do, both on IMF surveillance and climate change surveillance in particular, we single out, in the cases of the Article 4s, a number of case studies that were done, and one innovative one on Norway for the financial sector assessment programs. And so even though our research shows that the IMF has fallen short of making this widespread, they definitely have the toolkit now to be able to scale it in mainstream both physical and both kinds of transition risks that we outline as things move forward. Folks out there in the audience, we have enough time for just one last round of questions. You can pop them in the Q&A button in the corner here. We have a question from Natalia Escobar Pemberthy from the University of IMFT in Medellin, Colombia. And her question refers to the future perspectives for economic governance. How would organizations such as the IMF move forward now that on top of the challenges to balance health vulnerability and climate change, they seem to need to balance new fiscal challenges and issues with low or negative economic growth? How can they address the risks and manage all these priorities at the same time? There's the question of the hour. Who wants to refer to that one? Maybe Prakash, and then.
I mean, that would eat up more than the 7 minutes we have left. But I think we at the IEO are actually working on our book to mark our 20th anniversary. And this is one of the things we are trying to consider is within its mandate, what is its mandate? How can the IMF be more receptive to balancing a whole bunch of goals, as you said? I think a more holistic approach is what is needed. So as Kevin was saying, thinking of climate not as just kind of an add-on factor that the IMF has to think about on top of everything else, but just to mainstream climate in all aspects of our work, financial, as he was mentioning, but fiscal. So it's difficult these days to talk about the IMF's fiscal work without bringing in climate change. It's difficult to talk about financial risks in many cases without bringing in climate change. So I think recognizing that this is not an add-on, but it is really integral to the IMF delivering on its core mandate is, at least in my personal view, the way to go forward.
Yeah, thanks, Prakash. In the paper with Irena Monasterello, Luma Ramos, and our colleague from BU, Karina Stevenson, we outline the different sort of causal pathways, how climate change are macro-critical, and that when something is macro-critical, that obviously falls into the purview of the most important global institution to think about macro-critical issues. And so it's exciting to see that the International Monetary Fund is working to mainstream a number of these issues. And as we say in some of these papers, it's a real key first test in the next couple of weeks is the comprehensive surveillance review of Article 4s and the financial sector assessment programs. I'm not so sure when reviews of IMF emergency programs come through, because that's often where the rubber hits the road, where IMF financing comes in. Sometimes in the past, attention to more longer term or intermediate term financial mobilization goals has traditionally been put on the side to deal with an immediate crisis. And perhaps the biggest challenge for the fund moving forward on climate change is how to address immediate crises without derailing goals toward climate change and sustainable development. I want to thank especially Prakash Loungani for coming, all of my colleagues at the GDP Center, Barbara Fritz from the Free University of Berlin, and our collaborators at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development that helped put together and exhibit these interactives. In the chat, as I've said before, there's a number of links to these interactives, to the accompanying papers, to some of the work of Prakash. And you can link to our webpage or follow us on Twitter on how we monitor these things over time. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time. Have a good day.